Hello, this is Trevor Lossman, and welcome to my Geography in My Backyard project. Today, I'm out here at my deer lease, and we are going to be looking at the process of denudation, and in specifically the three processes of weathering, mass wasting, and erosion. So stay tuned, and we're going to find some examples of those out here on the property. So currently I'm standing on top of a interfluve and looking out onto a valley. If you hear any gunshots, don't worry, that's just the neighbors. Um, and I'm currently standing in this rocky patch of ground on this hillside where cedar trees have been cleared out by the property owners for cattle grazing to encourage grass growth. And so I'm standing right here in this rocky patch, and I have found a rock that I would like to show you. And it's a piece of limestone, and it is being weathered by a chemical process, and that chemical process is called carbonation. And so that's what happens is the water falls down onto the rock, and the CO2 in the water has a chemical reaction with the limestone, and it starts to weather the stone away over time. As you can see, the stone has a lot of little grooves and little indentions, and this is all where that water has fallen into it and started eroding that limestone away. And so that is the first process of denudation, which is weathering, which is chemical weathering, which is one of the forms of weathering, and we're going to look at some other forms as well, but this is an excellent example of chemical weathering. So I'm still on this same hillside looking at some different rocks, and I'm going to show you a process now known as mechanical weathering. And so whereas chemical weathering, the actual molecular structure of the rock is changed, in mechanical weathering, the rocks are just broken down into smaller pieces of that same type of rock. And so here's a great example of mechanical weathering. So as you can see, this rock right here was split in half right down the middle, and there could be multiple forces at play that would affect that rock splitting in half. One of them would be extreme temperature changes. So when it gets really hot and then really cold, like it does a lot in Texas, the molecules in the rock go from being standing really still to moving around a whole lot when it gets hot. And so over time, that process can cause cracks in the rock. And then also there's the freeze and thaw cycle, whereas water would seep into cracks in the rock, it would freeze, and when water freezes, it expands, and so that would create cracks and failures in the rock as well. We don't have as much freezing in Texas, but it does happen still. So it's probably a mixture of those two processes that would cause this rock to split in half right here. But that's an excellent example of mechanical weathering. So here's another good example of mechanical weathering in progress. So the smaller rock that we had looked at before was completely split in half. But this rock right here actually is developing a crack, as you can see right here. And so the crack that actually hasn't split apart yet, that is called a joint, whereas the rock we looked at before, which was completely split apart, is actually a fault. So there's a little bit of a difference between those two, and here's another example of mechanical weathering in action. So there's one more form of weathering, and that is biological weathering, where rocks are broken up by either plants or animals. And so we're currently standing in a pretty large field right now, and I am going to show you a place where the field has actually been dug up by feral hogs that are rooting around looking for things to eat. And so if you notice, these hogs have actually rooted up the ground, and they're actually helping break up these little chunks of dirt and rock and exposing them to the elements. And so that's actually a form of biological weathering. And that is the last and final form of weathering. So now we're on the second major step of denudation, which is called mass wasting, which is the process by which weathered materials move and fall because of gravity. And so right here we're looking at the side of the hillside, and I'm looking at some material right now. And so on this hillside, you can see all this loose rock and material that's coming off this hillside. And that's due to gravity wanting to pull it down, as well as when it rains, water pushing it as well. And so we can actually see all these weathered rocks at the bottom of this little hill right here. And these are all chunks that have fallen off of this hillside right here due to mass wasting and material sliding down this hill. And so that is the second major portion of denudation. So the last and final process of denudation is a process called erosion. And so erosion primarily happens through water, and there are a couple different steps. So the first step is splash erosion, where the raindrops actually come and hit the ground and break up particles on the ground. And then there's sheet erosion, which is the water running down like a sheet across the ground. There's rill erosion, where the water goes from a flat sheet and it goes into little indentions, like mini valleys that are in the ground, and the water starts working its way through there. And then finally, those rills all accumulate into a gully, which is basically a mini stream. And so here is a great process, great example. So we're standing out here in a relatively flat field. But as you might be able to tell, the field is actually kind of curved in here. So we're on this far corner, and if you look here, there is a gully that is actually starting to form right through here, which is being fed by little rills that I can't see right now, but that little rills that come and feed into this gully right here. And so if we keep walking this way, here's the gully. And so as you can see, as the water flows from the field and those little rills all the way down to this gully, it's actually eroding away the dirt and rocks through this area. Here, I'll go walk around the other side to show you where it is actually dug through the ground deep enough to see the roots of this cedar tree. So water has actually eroded all the way down deep enough to see the roots of this cedar tree down in there. And what it's doing is it's carrying small chunks of rock. Actually, this is a pretty big chunk of rock that was carried by that water, all the way down. Even if it's a relatively flat field, we can see that water has a huge effect, especially in erosion, by carrying those weathered particles down into a gully and depositing them somewhere else. So that is actually the final process of denudation, erosion, and that will actually conclude my geography, my backyard project. Thank you for your time, and I hope this was an enjoyable thing to watch.